This is Zestology, the podcast about energy and vitality, and I'm Tony Whiten on a very early spring blustery afternoon walking along the Thames in central London. Yeah, it's pretty windy, so I hope you can hear me okay. Today's podcast, what even is histamine intolerance? That's probably what you thought when you saw the title of this podcast. And why should you be concerned by it? Well, it's good questions, and it's very common, and in fact this podcast was inspired by my experience of histamine and histamine intolerance. Hopefully these questions will be answered for you in the podcast, and they certainly were for me. Dr. Joneja has written 7 books in the area of how we react to food, and Dr. Janice Joneja is the guest on today's podcast. She writes about food allergies and what goes on in the gut when you eat foods that don't agree with you. She's a researcher and an educator and an author and a counsellor as well, and she's been doing this for 30 years. So I think she's probably pretty much the world's top expert on histamine, and as you'll hear, she's got so much to say about it. And also, as you'll hear, so many people are suffering from this. So if you've got some unexplained symptoms, or every once in a while you just don't feel as good as you could do, which is me, which is why I was inspired to look her up, then you might enjoy today and this podcast about histamine, because as you'll hear, histamine is important. And when the total body level of histamine gets too high, it then goes from being important to unhelpful, and all sorts of odd and relatively unpleasant symptoms can occur. Well, histamine intolerance is not often diagnosed because people don't know about this stuff. So that's why I'm excited about today's podcast, and that is what we're going to be cracking on with. And I first asked her, what are the symptoms of histamine sensitivity?
It mimics allergy. And the reason that it mimics an allergy is because histamine is the first and most powerful of the mediators released in an allergic response. So let's just go through those symptoms that people would be familiar with. For example, itching, especially of the skin, eyes, ears. Whenever there's histamine around, we get itching because that's part of the functions of histamine. Is it's a neurotransmitter. It's producing these symptoms. Then we get flushing or reddening of the skin. This is because histamine has the effect of widening blood vessels. This is one of its protective effects, so that it can get more blood to the reaction site. If you injure yourself, for example, or if you have an allergic reaction at a particular site, then the blood vessels widen to bring more of the protective chemicals to that site. This means that more blood is there, and so you get the flushing and the reddening of the skin. Now, you also get the widening of the blood vessels, but at the same time, they become more permeable to get the protective chemicals to that reaction site. And so here we have fluid with the different chemicals in them seeping out of the blood vessels into the skin. This causes swelling that we can see as what we call angioedema in the deeper tissues, and in the surface tissues we get hives, the urticaria, the urticarial rash, those red patches that itch. So that's part of what histamine does. Then as a result of the tissue swelling, we get throat tightening, for example, and we also get in the ears, we can get, especially in young children with allergies, we see this, that histamine causing this permeability of the blood vessels causes swelling in those tiny little ear canals.
It's a huge list of symptoms.
Yeah, one of the most important is, of course, in the nasal tissues, you've got the swelling there, which causes the blocked nose, the runny nose with the fluid moving from the tissues. So you've got all of the symptoms of the typical hay fever type symptoms in the nose, and in the eyes, the watery reddened eyes. And then we've got the digestive problems, because as I mentioned earlier, histamine is involved in digestion. So we can have a lot of problems like heartburn, indigestion, reflux when there's too much acid. And then one of the things that really causes a lot of grief with people is when it affects there's a drop in blood pressure because you've got the widening of the vessels. So we've got a speeding up of the heart rate. So that's what we call a tachycardia. And people get very anxious. We get an anxiety effect from that. And people, and in extremes, can actually go into a sort of a panic attack because this is part of that drop in blood pressure and the speeding up of the heart rate. And I've even had patients who have a momentary loss of consciousness as a result of that too. So that would be an absolute extreme.
Yeah, but certainly when I was getting a lot of the stuff you just talked about, I've been experiencing over the last few months actually.
Yes.
And I mean the heart rate as well. Like there's a few times when my pulse was going so quick and I couldn't work out what was going on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's absolutely typical because you have this drop in blood pressure because you've got the widening of the vessels. It's like, when water is pumping, for example, from a tap. If you widen it, then the pressure goes down. And so the heart senses this and actually has to speed up to get the same volume of blood to the periphery as it would without the pressure, with the normal pressure, you see.
It's just an extraordinary array of symptoms. So, I mean, if someone's listening to this, they might listen to that and they might think, well, have I got earache or have I got histamine sensitivity? How can they work it out? How can they diagnose it?
Because you've always got histamine there anyway. Whether it's because of you having the histamine problem alone, which we would call histamine intolerance, or whether histamine is part of another reaction, which could be allergy. It could be conditions that we call mast cell activation disorders, where too much histamine is being released from too many mast cells. Mast cells are the white blood cells that actually make and store histamine. It boils down to the fact that no matter what you're dealing with, if you're dealing with excess histamine, you're going to have these symptoms. So the intolerance is really a condition where you've got a deficiency in the enzyme that breaks down histamine. You've got a deficiency, so it's not breaking it down quickly enough. But as I mentioned earlier, you can have excess histamine without having that deficit when you've got too much histamine coming from multiplicity of sources, which may be inside and also outside the body.
As you say, everyone's got histamine. And
Oh, yes.
everyone potentially, presumably, has a histamine sensitivity level.
Oh, yes. And I've equated that to having like a bucket. And as you fill up the bucket with water, when it overflows, that's synonymous with too much histamine and symptom development. So histamine builds up over time. And you can start with a nice, easy level of water in the bucket, no problem, no overflow, no symptoms. But if you exceed that bucket's capacity, then it overflows and you've got too much histamine and you've got symptoms. And many factors can contribute to that bucket filling up with water. And everybody has what we call a limit of tolerance, which is when beyond which too much histamine will cause symptoms.
Well, I'm familiar with that bucket analogy because I've been reading your book and it's been excellent. I found it very helpful, actually. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah. And what percentage do you think of the population has some kind of issue with histamine sensitivity? I mean, I'm thinking of people listening to this and thinking, is this something I should be worried about or not?
You only worry if you have symptoms.
Yeah.
And it's certainly, if you've only got histamine intolerance as an enzyme deficiency, it's not life-threatening, cannot be. But if you have it as a result of an allergy, and particularly if you have a risk of anaphylactic reactions to foods, or any other allergen, actually, then it can be life-threatening. It's not the histamine, it's the underlying condition that would be life-threatening. But if you've just simply got a deficiency, and actually there are genes which code for the enzymes that break down histamine, and if you have a genetic analysis, for example, it will tell you whether you have deficiencies in those genes that code or what we call it a sort of not deficiency in the gene, obviously, it's a change in the gene that would mean that you've got a defect in that enzyme system. That would tell you that you'd got histamine intolerance, and it's sort of, okay, I can deal with that. But the important thing, very important for anyone listening, is first of all, find out if you have a medical condition that should be more appropriately dealt with first.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's very good advice. And then after that, listen to Zestology and listen to you and take your advice. So, I mean, one of the ways that you talk about in the book of sorting it out is, and the best way really, is kind of to follow a low histamine diet. And I've been doing that, and this is part of the reason I wanted to speak to you. I've been doing that for the last couple of weeks, and I've been feeling a lot better on it, which suggests that I have got some kind of histamine sensitivity. My nose has been a little bit less blocked up. My eyes have been less runny.
Yes.
I've been getting less headaches. I've been sleeping better. And a number of other things that I've been feeling. Oh, and my stomach's been better as well.
Oh, good.
So,
yeah, that's all very, very indicative of having histamine excess.
The problem is that, I mean, I'm used to kind of quite a low carb diet, and a lot of the things that I love, Dr. Janice, aren't allowed on the low histamine diet. Like,
Sorry about that.
I know, like avocados and chocolate. I mean, it's just a disaster zone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I know what you're saying, but I've had this. I've been in practice for well over 30 years dealing with adverse reactions to foods, and people are saying, "Oh, but it's a healthy diet that I'm following, but there are so many of your foods on that diet that you've got on your histamine restricted diet. It's a healthy diet. I like these foods, and now you say I can't have them." And I said, well, you have a choice, you've always got a choice. You can eat the foods that you love and so on and so forth, but be prepared to deal with the consequences. And if you balance that, fine, it's your choice.
Yeah, it's and I suppose another one of your messages, I think, but I want to check this with you, is that if you can empty the bucket, so let's say you follow the histamine diet for a while, the low histamine diet, then when the bucket becomes emptier, then you can tolerate certain qualities. So I can go back to the chocolate, can't I? That's what I'm saying.
You can have the chocolate occasionally, as long as you don't have a lot of other histamine containing or histamine releasing foods at the same time.
Right.
So, if you have a pizza, for example, and you have, we'll have tomato sauce, we'll have cheese, we'll have pepperoni, and then I'll have a glass of beer with it. Lovely. You've totally gone over the top.
Okay. The beer tips you over the top, does it? Yeah. So, I mean, the diet is the first thing. And I think one of the things about the diet that makes it quite difficult is obviously being the way I am. This is just the way I am. I kind of tend to do plenty of research on a topic, and I read your book, and I've read a number of kind of articles on the internet about it. And it seems like histamine, it's an area of growing emergence, and clearly you are right at the forefront of it. But
actually, you're right there, because the first time my first histamine restricted diet was published in my book in 1995. And in order to get the research for that that article and the diet, most of the research papers were in German. I was very fortunate because I had a graduate student at the time working with me, and she translated them for me. And so in those days, there weren't even any real English researchers in the field.
Wow, yeah. And what's interesting to me now is it is clearly still an emerging field. I mean, I know you said something in the book about how we're not sure why eggs release histamine, but we think they do. And
Yes.
it seems like a lot of other sites, they do. There's some conflicting views on what foods are high histamine and what aren't, which can make it quite a kind of difficult area to navigate, because one site will say that bananas are high histamine and the next will say that they're not. Have you found that?
They're not, actually. It's not histamine at all. It's tyramine. Or there are other sort of mediators that people have sort of said, "Oh, I'll pop that in there," but they don't understand the science behind it. I'm a scientist. That's
Yeah.
where my doctorate is, in medical microbiology and immunology. So I was very knowledgeable about the biochemistry and physiology of the responses long before I added the dietetics to my practice.
Okay, so I mean, have you noticed that a lot of the histamine lists, for example, contain quite differing information on what to follow and what not to follow?
Yes, it's because people tend to put in their own biases. One of the best sites I've always found that I like to look at is the Swiss interest group on histamine intolerance. That one I have found over the years, right from the beginning, has been the most reliable of the research and the lists that they put out. And they have modified their lists over time, and they have admitted that, that some of these are far too extensive and then need not be followed to the extent that some people have put out on the internet, for example. So that one I like to follow, the Swiss interest group.
It's just so interesting, isn't it? Because it's something that, I mean, I've been doing this podcast for quite a few years, and I've always been someone who's kind of interested in my health. And I've genuinely noticed a massive change in how I'm feeling over the last few weeks since I've started. I mean, and it's been more than 2 weeks that I've been looking into this, but since I've been taking a couple of natural supplements to lower histamine a bit as well, which seems to work a little bit. And I mean, do you suffer from histamine sensitivity? Is that how you kind of got interested in it all?
That's a leading question, but there are 4 principal genes in the body that code for the enzymes that break down histamine, diamine oxidase, and another one for histamine N-methyltransferase, which sort of augments the diamine oxidase. And I've got deficits in 4 out of the 5.
Have you really?
Yeah, I haven't found anyone quite as bad, but I'm sure there are. But yes, and of course my children.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your loss is the world's gain, because you've been forced to get
Believe
involved.
me, I've walked the path very.
So what are those? I mean, this is getting technical, but a lot of people listening to this will have done the 23andMe. What are the genes? Yes. There's DAO, which is obviously the one that is most associated with histamine, DAO. But what are the other genes that are associated with histamine sensitivity?
Oh, you would ask me that. It's on the other side of my office, because they've got numbers, the sequence of numbers for each of them.
Right.
They don't have names, obviously.
Oh, okay.
But they have a sequence of numbers, and there are, and it's on the other side of my office.
Well, no, don't worry. If it's just numbers, that's probably even beyond my levels of geekiness. But
there are, and they are indicated. I think they're on my site somewhere too. If you go to either my website or my books, I think I've mentioned it in at least the professional guide. I think you'll find it there.
Okay, yeah, because I was certainly looking at the DAO, the DAO gene, which I don't think.
But there are 4 of those, you see.
Are there?
Oh yeah, 4 different ones.
Oh right, because I've got an analysis in front of me that's just one. AOC1 DAO, but presumably there's lots of them.
Oh well, you're fortunate because you've got 3 others that work.
Well, I don't. It's not analysed that. It's just analysed that one. And
Oh,
it's at
just
those
that one. Well, that's
minus
probably the only
minus.
one
Yeah.
that's out as far as you're concerned. I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know how, but the one I was looking at the genetics. This is going to the genomics sites
Yes.
and
Okay.
so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then looking at my gene profile specifically, then I've identified.
Right. Okay. And I mean, it's this low histamine diet is fascinating because
Mhm.
we can't have avocado, we can't
No.
have chocolate. What about
Mm.
coffee? Are we allowed that?
Yes, you can have coffee. It's tea that is the problem, and it's not the caffeine. It's the benzoate in tea, because if you look at my some of my articles, you'll see that we not only have foods that are high in histamine because of manufacturing processes or the ripening process and so on, of the fruit or vegetable. What we have are certain chemicals in particularly processed foods that will cause the release of histamine in certain sensitive people. Benzoates are one of those chemicals, and I researched this. Oh my gosh, as I said, 95. That's where I came up with this one. And the benzoates and artificial colors such as tartrazine, which is a yellow color,
Mm.
sulfites, and some preservatives have the effect of releasing histamine in certain sensitive people. And benzoates, for example, benzoates are high in tea, both black and green tea, and in berries particularly. So a lot of the berries are out, and depending on the sensitivity level of a person, some of the berries might be tolerated. For example, people ask me about blueberries, and blueberries, some people can eat them, some can't, because they've got that degree of sensitivity to the benzoate in the berries.
Yeah, I read that over the last couple of days. I eat so many berries, so it's a bit gutting. But I mean,
And
it's
it's the
trial and error and
benzoate.
everything.
It's not that the berry itself contains histamine. It's the fact that in the body, the benzoate, the natural benzoate in the berry, will release histamine in sensitive people.
And do you think when people are listening to this and they say, okay, well, maybe I will, maybe I'll try giving up avocado and berries and chocolate, but not coffee, and they
No,
really
they're
might,
fine with coffee. Most
yeah,
people can tolerate coffee.
and they really might start feeling better quite quickly. I mean, that's really exciting and clear-headed and everything else.
There's one thing that I've been looking at, and this is a question because you're talking about the different lists.
Mm,
Some of the lists, my list, for example, olives are off because they have histamine,
yes.
but some of the lists allow olive oil. Now, looking at that very carefully, there's a very interesting thing about olive oil, and that is in some people, it will increase diamine oxidase. And so they think, oh, I can get olive oil and it's good for me because it increases my diamine oxidase. But here's the tricky part about this. The olive oil and a lot of fats, to be absorbed initially, will cause the release of histamine. The histamine itself triggers the production of the diamine oxidase. So here you've got a group of people who will benefit from olive oil because they have an increase in their diamine oxidase. However, if that person, another person, has a deficit in the gene that produces diamine oxidase, they will still produce the histamine, but the diamine oxidase that follows is going to be inadequate to break down that initial production of histamine. And so they're the people who are going to react adversely to the olive oil, whereas people producing enough diamine oxidase will benefit from it.
Right. Okay. So that's
So
wow. So olive oil. I didn't realize olive oil was potentially on the list as well.
Oh, it is. You
Yeah.
must read the list again.
I know. Well, I need
And
to
I
memorize
will
it.
admit I'm talking to people who have a deficit. So those diets really are for people who are going to have a problem. And the olive oil, although yes, there is scientific evidence that olive oil will increase diamine oxidase, but not sufficiently for the people who already have a deficit.
Right.
So this is where the list becomes very ambiguous for some people,
Mm.
because some lists will say olive oil is good because it increases thiamine oxidase, and the other list will say no, 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 it isn't, because it also increases histamine, and the diamine oxidase that it does induce is insufficient to break down that histamine. So with those people, you're going to have olive oil causing histamine symptoms if you've got too much of it.
And I mean, it is difficult, isn't it? I mean, there's so much. How strictly do you follow this histamine diet now?
Oh, I follow it entirely because, well, I do, but if I choose not to, I suffer.
Do you? Yeah. Because I mean, for
So
instance, I got a
my,
muffin
my,
earlier. Yes.
my answer is if I want a couple of glasses of wine, I'll go ahead and have it, but I have to put up with the consequences, which are not pleasant.
That's so funny you mentioned wine, because for years I've had these huge reactions to wine, and I've been wearing this Oura ring now that measures your heart rate, and it measures your heart rate overnight. And when I have even half a glass of wine, seriously, not even a full glass, my heart rate is 10 beats a minute higher overnight. And
Exactly.
Is that histamine, do you think?
Oh, absolutely, no question. And a very interesting thing about histamine is the production, the natural production of histamine in your body follows a circadian rhythm. And so people often have symptoms of histamine excess that occur early morning. Quite early, maybe 5 o'clock in the
Yeah.
morning or 4 o'clock. They wake up and they've got a racing heart rate, they've got, itchy, or all the symptoms that they might have. Now, the reason for that is twofold. One is that histamine is built up during the day because you've been consuming different histamine-containing foods, and that builds up the level of your bucket. But the maximum production, and this work has been done on laboratory animals, of course, rats and so on. But the maximum production of histamine is in the early morning hours. So between 2 and 5 in the morning, your maximum production of histamine in your body.
That's another thing that I've noticed. I feel very kind of clear-headed, and I breathe very clearly overnight. And then early in the morning, maybe 6 or 7, but maybe my circadian clock's a bit later, I start to get stuffed up.
That's the one, yeah.
Wow.
That's because your histamine level has risen, of course, and when it's building up from your diet or environmental factors, if you have allergies or whatever point, whatever source your histamine is being increased. But then you've got your natural circadian rhythm production of histamine, which is going to be early morning. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing is, it's all very exciting knowing this, even though it is, I mean, it's slightly daunting, the diet part of it, but it's very exciting knowing it because you can do something about it. And one of the things you can do is there are these diamine oxidase supplements that you talk about in your book, and I've tried them, and I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about supplements actually. One of the issues I had with these Dow supplements, if you like, is that all of them on the market seem to have an ingredient which is talc in them.
Yeah.
I wonder if I could ask you a bit more about that, because talc seems to me to be not something that we really want to be ingesting.
Exactly. The way that diamine oxidase supplements work, DAO does not enter the body. It's just enzyme that's active, and you take it just before a meal, and it mixes with the food and breaks down the histamine in the food. So what it does is to reduce the amount of histamine that's going to be absorbed into the body from your food as it passes through the digestive tract. Now, you won't have any adverse effects to the diamine oxidase because it's not entering the body to begin with. But the ingredients in the supplement will enter the body, and any adverse effects are going to be to the ingredients in the supplement.
But isn't it frustrating that they put talc in it? I think it's one company, isn't it, that's making all these Dow
Yeah,
products?
yeah. There's only one, to my knowledge, at the moment. There was several, but they're all coming from the same
Yes.
supplier. I believe they're in Austria,
Yeah.
maybe. Yeah. And unfortunately, they have to have something. A lot of the pills that we take and so on do have talc or some other ingredient to make it into a pill. You see, how that enzyme is a tiny, tiny amount, and you've got to have it in something that's going to be transportable or to be able to transport it. And some have corn starch in them and all sorts of if you go online, actually you can find out the type of vehicle, if you call it vehicle, that will carry active medicinal compounds, and so you'll find that all of them, pills of any type, have got to have something that's going to carry it, and talc seems to be one of the it's a mineral. It's just, it's like anything that it's very inert. It's not going to harm you very much.
Really?
You're
I thought it
thinking
was.
of talcum powder, I know.
Well, I am, but I need you to put me right then, because I mean, obviously, there's a lot of publicity about talcum powder and the negative effects it can cause. What's different between talc that you swallow and talcum powder that you put on your skin? Because it's the same thing,
Well,
isn't
with
it?
talcum powder, you've got a numerous list of all the other things they are talcum powder. You've got perfumes, you've got stabilizers, you've got
Yes.
preservatives, you've got, oh my goodness, you've got so many things in talcum powder. But talc itself is a mineral. And so, it's like scraping off a bit off a rock and eating that.
Do you take those Dow supplements with your food?
No.
No. Do you just find it doesn't help that much?
Not really, no, because you can't take them without having a low histamine diet anyway. And as if you can reduce the histamine in your food, that's what you need to do. And just make sure that you know all of the foods that contain histamine, rather than the ones that I've been speaking about in addition, which are the releases.
Yeah.
Those are different. Just avoid the high histamine foods. I mean, yeah. That's best.
It's quite hard, isn't it? I mean, I was just about to say before, I bought a muffin earlier on, and then I was just eating it, and then I noticed in the ingredients there's a tiny bit of raspberry in it. And I was, there's a lot to
Yes,
look
but
out for.
the raspberry itself, that tiny bit, isn't going to give you a reaction. It's not like having an allergy that you have a small amount and you
Yes.
have a reaction. No. It's got to be part of that bucket, and
Okay.
if you've got
Yeah.
a tiny bit of raspberry in it, well, what the heck, it probably won't increase your bucket very much.
Yeah. Now, another supplement that I've been very interested in, I haven't tried yet, but I wanted to ask you about is apparently beef kidney, can contribute in promoting the body's natural stores of Dow, and grass-fed kidney supplements. A lot of people have had massive help from this with their histamine levels. Have you heard of this?
Well, don't forget that diamine oxidase itself is an extract of pig kidney.
Right.
It's extracted from the pig's kidney, and it is concentrated and then put into a pill form. So it's just the same source.
Right. Although it's from beef, these supplements
Oh,
are
it
from
doesn't
beef
matter.
rather
Kidney
than
will do it.
pork.
If you look at my books, you'll see where histamine is concentrated in the kidney, and so on. That's where the highest source. I've been trying experiments with the different groups online to try and find a plant source
Yeah.
of, and the pea sprouts are one of the best. You sprout them yourself, and just before 10 days of sprouting, you then grind them up and eat them, whatever. That's a plant source that I've been looking at to see if we can't find one that is a very interesting source of diamine oxidase for women is when they're pregnant, because the placenta produces diamine oxidase. And so many of the women that I know who have histamine intolerance in my practice, or have allergies for that matter, they have a wonderful time when they're pregnant because they don't have any symptoms. But as soon as the baby's born, they have to lose their source of diamine oxidase. So there are some people looking at the placenta as a possible source of diamine oxidase.
But I'm still amazed that you don't, for instance, take these grass-fed kidney supplements yourself, or the Dow supplement. You just don't think they work well enough to make much of a difference, or you just got it all under control.
No, not really.
No.
It's a good try. Why not try it? I wouldn't bother.
So is this diet forever then? If there's histamine stuff going on?
If you have an enzyme deficiency, yes, it will be. However, if your histamine excess is coming from an underlying source, which of course could be mast cell activation disorder, allergy, an autoimmune process, or even chronic inflammation. For example, if people have chronic rheumatoid arthritis where they have chronic inflammation, any chronic inflammatory process or any other source, if you address those problems, your histamine level will drop naturally, and you should be okay if you've got a normal level of diamine oxidase production.
Right, yeah. And I think that's the confusing bit almost, isn't it? If there is a histamine thing going on, trying to work out what it is. I mean, mast cell activation syndrome, or just a fact you haven't got enough of the gene that produces the stuff that kind of dampens your histamine down a bit. That seems to me to be quite a complicated process to work that out.
Mm-hmm. And in the end, if you want to control your symptoms, and don't forget we're talking about symptoms which are caused by histamine excess, then reduce what you can. There isn't a lot really that we have complete control about in our lives as far as health is concerned. But the one thing we can control is what we put into our mouth.
Is all chocolate out then? Should we just go back to chocolate?
You really like chocolate, don't you?
Yeah.
Actually, no. I think probably a lot of people can tolerate chocolate because it's just from the cocoa bean, which is similar to the. Well, I don't know. It's not the same as the coffee bean, is it? So, yeah. Again, moderation. If you can keep your level below the top of the bucket, have your chocolate, but don't have strawberries with it.
Yeah, well, there you go. Dr. Janice, it's just wonderful to pick your brain like this and to ask you all these questions. Something that I've asked everybody on Zestology is, what is one book that you would recommend? And by the way, it can be about histamine or anything else, fiction or non-fiction, anything you like. And what is one tip you would have for living with more energy and vitality?
Of course, as people with histamine intolerance, I've got to say my own books, of course. Yeah. I mean, I can't get away from that one. So if you do have all of these symptoms, and low energy, of course, can be part of all of this, because when you've got these symptoms, you're going to have a lot of lacking of energy and everything else that goes with good health. And so, yes, I would say my books on histamine intolerance, both the beginner's guide and the comprehensive guide for healthcare professionals, I would definitely recommend those.
Yeah, brilliant. And then what about one tip for living with more energy and vitality? Is it linked to histamine? I know you've been involved in all sorts of health matters and scientific matters for many years.
What I have experienced, I can only speak, sort of personally here, would be that I get the greatest vitality from not from any particular health issue, it's from a mental health issue. The greatest vitality for me is something that I'm excited to do, I'm excited about, that I have great interest in. It gives me a wonderful feeling of being able to contribute, to be able to be part of the living world, and it's more to find something that I am really excited about, really can contribute to, and feel that I'm not living in vain, sort of thing. I'm here that I can actually be part of the living world and contribute to it. To me, that is the greatest thing that's ever given me vitality.
Well, look, thank you for coming on Zestology. Where could you just remind us of your website and also the book one more time?
Yeah, my website is allergynutrition.com. It's all one word, lowercase, allergynutrition.com. And my books are on histamine. On my website, you'll see that I've got 10 different books. But the two that I would recommend for histamine specifically are the histamine intolerance, the comprehensive guide for healthcare professionals, and the beginner's guide for people who are just exploring the beginnings of this. And the other one on food would be, both of those, by the way, are available on Amazon.
Yes.
And the other one is a very comprehensive book on food allergies that I wrote for the American Academy of Nutrition. So that's the American site would be my guide for professionals, really, on food allergies.
Yeah. Great. Well, enjoy your chocolate-free dinner tonight. Thank you for...
You know, Tony, I hate to admit this, but I don't like chocolate.
Ah, that's. I do. I wish you hadn't put it on the banned list.
But I find it too oily tasting. I don't know. I've never found a chocolate that I really like. So no, thank you.
I think you said that is cacao all right, or cocoa?
Well, that's the source. You see, that's the cocoa bean which is what we're looking at as far as histamine is concerned.
Oh dear. Thanks to Dr. Janice, and I'm still down here by the Thames in London. There's a big boat which has been kind of hoisted onto some wooden planks, and they're doing some repairs to the underside of the boat while the Thames is out. A few birds around, late afternoon day. It's not very warm, but hopefully it'll be warming up soon here in London. It's probably enough of my nature watch for you on this podcast, but it is nice being down here and soaking up a little bit of nature as well. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast, and if you enjoy this podcast, you might enjoy the email I send out every Monday morning with stuff that doesn't go in the podcast. Books that I've read, supplements that I've taken, gadgets that I've tried, stuff that works. Or it doesn't work, and I want to tell you about it so you don't have to try it. If you head to tonywrighton.com, it's tonywrighton.com. It's all very self-explanatory once you get there, and you can sign up there. Until next week. Have a good one, have a zesty week, and I'll see you soon.